The phone rang while I was seasoning a pot of vegetable soup. I remember that detail because everything about that evening had felt ordinary until it didn't. The windows over my kitchen sink reflected the fading light, and soft music drifted from the old radio sitting beside the coffee maker. I almost ignored the call. Since retiring, most phone calls could wait a few minutes. I dried my hands on a towel and pressed the speaker button without checking the screen. "Mom," my daughter said quickly, "I just wanted to let you know you don't need to come to the lake house this summer. Daniel thinks it would be better if we keep it for our immediate family this year." There wasn't even a pause. "Love you. I'll call later." The line went dead. I stood motionless, the wooden spoon still resting in my hand while the soup bubbled quietly behind me. At first, I honestly believed I had misunderstood her. The lake house? The one I had purchased with my own money? The one I had spent nearly 2 years building from an empty piece of land? Surely she couldn't mean that house. I switched off the stove and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the dark phone screen. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I'm 68 years old, a retired registered nurse, and a widow of 9 years. After spending more than 3 decades caring for other people, I thought I had learned how to recognize pain before it arrived. I was wrong. Some wounds don't announce themselves. They simply appear in the middle of an ordinary evening. I considered calling my daughter back. Not because I wanted an argument. I only wanted to hear her repeat what she'd said, maybe slower this time. Maybe with an explanation that would somehow make sense. Instead, I placed the phone face down and remained silent. Sometimes silence tells you more than another conversation ever could. That night, sleep refused to come. I kept replaying her words, not because they were cruel, because they were casual. She had spoken as though the decision had already been made. As though someone else's permission now mattered more than mine. By sunrise, I realized something inside our relationship had shifted. I simply hadn't noticed it happening. The lake house had never been an impulsive purchase. Years before my husband, Richard, became ill, we'd often drive through northern Georgia on weekend trips. Every time we passed a quiet lake, he'd slow the car and smile. "One day," he'd say, "we'll have a porch overlooking water." I always laughed. "We're nurses and accountants," I'd tease, "not millionaires." "We don't need millions," he'd answer, "just enough." When cancer entered our lives, those conversations disappeared. Hospital visits replaced weekend drives. Treatment schedules replaced vacation plans. Hope slowly became acceptance. After Richard passed away, I spent nearly 18 months simply learning how to exist without him. Then one afternoon I found an old notebook. Inside were sketches, Sybil pencil drawings, a wraparound porch, large kitchen windows, a stone fireplace, nothing elaborate, just home. I cried harder that afternoon than I had in months, not because of the drawings. Because they reminded me that dreams don't always die with the people who imagine them. Sometimes someone else has to finish them. Using Richard's life insurance together with the savings I'd built during my career, I purchased 6 acres overlooking Lake Oconee. The deed listed only one owner, Eleanor Brooks. Every payment came from my accounts. Every construction decision was mine. Every permit carried my signature. The house wasn't an inheritance. It wasn't a family investment. It wasn't a shared vacation property. It was my home. Building it tested every ounce of patience I possessed. Every other weekend I drove nearly 2 hours to meet contractors, approve materials, and answer endless questions. What kind of flooring? What style of cabinets? What color roof? The builder, a quiet man named Harold, rarely wasted words. If you want quality, he'd tell me, you'll need patience. I've waited my whole life. I'd answer, I can wait a little longer. Room by room, the house slowly emerged. When construction finally ended, I unlocked the front door alone. No balloons, no celebration, no family waiting inside, just silence. Yet it wasn't lonely. It felt peaceful. I walked through every room slowly. Touching walls I had watched rise from bare concrete. When I reached the kitchen, sunlight poured across the hardwood floors exactly as Richard had imagined years earlier. For the first time since losing him, I smiled without forcing it. I whispered softly into the empty house. We finally made it. The words echoed gently through the living room. I believed that house would become the place where my family gathered for decades. I never imagined it would one day become the reason we started falling apart. The first summer after the house was finished became everything I had hoped it would be. My daughter, Claire, arrived with her husband, Daniel, and their 2 children on a warm Friday afternoon. My son, Adam, drove in the following day with his wife, Melissa. By sunset, the quiet house had transformed into the lively family retreat Richard and I had once imagined. Laughter echoed across the back porch. The grandchildren chased each other through the yard, while Daniel grilled burgers near the patio. Adam helped me carry coolers from the garage, and Melissa insisted on setting the dining table before I could stop her. For the first time in years, the house felt complete. Every room was occupied. Every chair had someone sitting in it. Every meal stretched into long conversations that lasted well after dark. Those memories became some of the happiest of my life. Claire would join me each morning in the kitchen while everyone else slept. We'd drink coffee by the large windows overlooking the lake, talking about work, parenting, and the little things that filled everyday life. "You really did it, Mom," she said one morning, looking around the kitchen. "I guess I did. Dad would have loved this place." I smiled. I built it for both of us. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. In that moment, I believed nothing could ever come between us. Looking back now, I wish I had frozen time right there, because the following summer felt different, not dramatically, not all at once. Just enough for me to notice that something had quietly begun to change. Daniel started making suggestions. At first, they sounded harmless. "You know," he said while standing in the upstairs guest room, "this would make a great home office." Another weekend, he pointed toward the unfinished storage room. "You could easily convert this into another bedroom." I nodded politely. "They're interesting ideas." He smiled. "I've been thinking about ways to improve the place." The wording struck me as odd, improve the place, as though it already belonged to him. Still, I ignored the feeling. Families discuss ideas all the time. There was no reason to assume anything more. Weeks later, I arrived for another visit and immediately noticed the furniture had been rearranged. The reading chair I'd carefully positioned beside the fireplace now sat against the opposite wall. Several framed photographs had disappeared from the mantel. The guest bedroom had been transformed into Daniel's workspace, complete with computer monitors, filing cabinets, and shelves filled with business folders. Nobody had mentioned any of it. Claire noticed me looking around. "Oh," she said casually. "Daniel thought this layout worked better. I see. It makes more sense this way." I forced a smile. "If you're comfortable." Inside, however, something didn't sit right. Nobody had asked. They had simply decided. The small changes continued over the following months. Kitchen cabinets were reorganized. My gardening tools disappeared from the shed because Daniel needed the space for fishing equipment. Even family weekends slowly began revolving around his schedule. If Daniel had work meetings, breakfast happened later. If he wanted quiet, the grandchildren were told to play farther from the house. The rhythm I had created slowly became someone else's. One Saturday afternoon, I found Claire replacing the curtains in the living room. "The blue ones look dated," she explained. "I liked those curtains." She hesitated. "I know, but these brighten the room." I looked around carefully. Almost every decorative choice reflected Claire and Daniel's taste now. Mine had quietly disappeared. I reminded myself that families evolve. People decorate differently. It wasn't worth creating conflict over curtains. But deep inside, I knew this wasn't really about curtains. It was about ownership. About respect. About remembering whose dream this house had always been. The conversation that changed everything happened near the end of that summer. We were sitting on the porch watching the grandchildren skip stones across the lake. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "we spend more time here than anyone else." Claire nodded. "That's true," he continued. "It would probably make sense if we treated this as our permanent vacation place." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "You hardly use it anymore." I use it whenever I choose, sure, he replied. But we're here almost every weekend. Claire spoke softly. I think Daniel just means it makes practical sense. Practical, there was that word again. I folded my hands calmly. This house isn't about convenience. Neither of them answered. After a long silence, Claire finally smiled awkwardly. Of course it's still your house, Mom. She said the words, but somehow they no longer sounded true. That evening, while everyone slept upstairs, I remained alone on the porch long after midnight. The lake was perfectly still. Yet inside me, something had begun to stir. For the first time since building the house, I felt like a guest inside the very home that carried my name on every legal document. I didn't know it then, but the hardest lesson was still waiting for me, and it would arrive in the form of a single envelope. The envelope arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. It looked ordinary, a plain white envelope with my name neatly typed across the front. No handwritten note, no greeting card, nothing that hinted at what waited inside. I carried it into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, and opened it without giving it much thought. Within seconds, my appetite disappeared. The letter came from an attorney I had never met. The language was polite, carefully worded, and completely professional. It explained that Claire and Daniel wished to discuss transferring ownership of the lake house into their names. According to the letter, such a transfer would simplify future family planning and ensure the property remained available for future generations. There was no accusation, no threat, no legal demand. Just an assumption that I would eventually sign away everything I had worked for. I read the letter twice, then a third time. Each reading made one thing clearer. Someone believed they already had a claim to my home. I folded the papers carefully and placed them back inside the envelope. For several minutes, I simply stared out the kitchen window. The issue wasn't the paperwork. It was the confidence behind it. No one sends a lawyer unless they believe the answer should already be yes. 3 days later, I decided to visit the lake house without telling anyone. The drive felt strangely familiar, yet unusually heavy. For years, every trip there had filled me with excitement. This time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was driving towards something I didn't want to confirm. When I reached the property, everything looked exactly the same. The flower beds were blooming. The porch swing moved gently in the breeze. The lake shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. From the outside, nothing had changed. I walked to the front door, reached into my purse, and pulled out my key. I slid it into the lock. It wouldn't turn. I frowned and tried again. Nothing, maybe I had grabbed the wrong key. I checked my key ring. No, it was the correct one. I tried once more. The lock had been replaced. I stood there silently, staring at the doorknob. The realization hit me before I even reached for my phone. Someone had changed the locks on my house. Without telling me, I called Claire. She answered after the second ring. "Hi, Mom. My key doesn't work." A brief silence followed. "Oh, right." Her voice sounded almost rehearsed. "Daniel had the locks changed last week." "Why?" "It was just for security." "Security from whom?" "It wasn't a big deal. It became a big deal when the owner couldn't get inside." Another pause. "I meant to tell you, but you didn't," she sighed. "We'll get you another key." I looked at the front door. My own house shouldn't require permission. Neither of us spoke. After another awkward silence, she quietly said, "I'm sorry." But the apology felt incomplete. It acknowledged my feelings, not their actions. I never asked for the new key. Instead, I turned around, walked back to my car, and sat behind the steering wheel without starting the engine. The house stood only a few yards away. A house I had built. A house I had paid for. A house that now felt farther away than any place I'd ever lived. I stayed there nearly 20 minutes, not crying, not angry, just thinking. Over the past 2 years, I had ignored every warning sign. The rearranged furniture, the changed decorations, the casual conversations about their plans, the attorney's letter. Every time something felt wrong, I convinced myself I was overreacting. Now the evidence stood directly in front of me. They hadn't forgotten who owned the house. They simply expected me to stop acting like I did. That realization hurt far more than the locked door. Back home, I retrieved the large blue folder from my office cabinet. Inside were every document connected to the property, the purchase agreement, the recorded deed, construction invoices, building permits, bank statements, insurance policies. Every page carried only one legal owner, Eleanor Brooks. No joint ownership, no trust, no transfer agreement. Nothing gave anyone else authority over that property. I organized the papers across my dining room table and studied them one by one. For the first time in months, I stopped making excuses for my daughter and her husband. Facts don't need interpretation. Either someone respects your ownership, or they don't. That evening, I called Claire once more. I was thinking about spending this weekend at the lake. She hesitated. This weekend might not work. I'll stay out of everyone's way. We already have plans. What about next weekend? I'll have to ask Daniel. Those 6 words echoed inside my mind. I'll have to ask Daniel. She wasn't asking the owner. She was asking the man who had already begun behaving like one. I ended the conversation politely. Afterward, I sat alone in the quiet house for a long time. Then I opened my laptop and searched for local real estate agents near Lake Oconee. By midnight, I had selected one. The following morning, I scheduled an appointment. For the first time since all of this began, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing to make a decision that would change everything. The real estate agent arrived the following Thursday afternoon. Her name was Linda Carter, and unlike many salespeople I'd met over the years, she didn't waste time making promises she couldn't keep. She walked through the property with a small notebook in her hand, occasionally stopping to jot down observations. After nearly an hour, she joined me on the back porch overlooking the lake. "You've taken excellent care of this place," she said. "I've tried. The market is strong right now." "I've heard," she nodded. "If you decide to sell, I don't think it'll stay on the market very long." I looked across the calm water. "I'm not interested in a long process." She studied my face for a moment before speaking again. "Has something happened?" I smiled politely. "Let's just say I'm ready for a new chapter." She didn't ask another question. I appreciated that. Some stories don't need to be explained to strangers. The listing went live the following Monday. Professional photographs captured every room exactly as I remembered designing it years earlier. The spacious kitchen, the stone fireplace, the screened porch facing the lake, the sunrise reflecting across the water. Within 24 hours, Linda called. "We already have 3 showings scheduled." By the end of the week, that number had doubled. Interest came from families looking for vacation homes, retirees searching for quiet lakeside living, and one couple hoping to relocate permanently. Every evening Linda called with updates. "We've received our first offer." The next day she called again. "Now there are 2. Then another. And one of them is all cash." She emailed each proposal for me to review. Some buyers offered more money but requested lengthy inspections and extended closing dates. One couple submitted a clean cash offer with a short closing timeline and almost no conditions. Linda pointed toward that contract. "If I were advising my own family," she said, "this is the one I'd choose." I agreed. The amount exceeded what I'd expected. But surprisingly, the money wasn't what convinced me. It was certainty. I wanted everything completed before anyone had the opportunity to interfere. The paperwork moved quickly. I met Linda and the closing attorney in a small conference room overlooking the courthouse square. Stackers of documents waited neatly arranged before me. Each signature represented another step toward closing one chapter of my life. The attorney reviewed every page carefully. "Mrs. Brooks, do you understand that once these documents are recorded, ownership transfers permanently to the buyers?" "I understand." He smiled kindly. "Are you signing voluntarily?" "Absolutely." I signed my name one final time, Eleanor Brooks. When the last document was notarized, the attorney extended his hand. "Congratulations." For a brief moment, I wasn't sure whether congratulations was the right word. Perhaps freedom fit better. A week later, the sale officially closed. The funds appeared in my account early that morning. I looked at the balance only once before closing my banking app. Money had never been the point. Peace was. I spent the next several days quietly settling into my normal routine: morning walks, gardening, reading on the back patio. I didn't contact Claire, she didn't contact me either. The silence felt strange. Yet strangely comforting, it allowed me to think clearly for the first time in months. Everything changed the following Saturday. My phone rang repeatedly just after noon. 3 missed calls, then 4, then 6. Finally, I answered. "Mom," Claire sounded breathhouse. I remained silent. "They're moving furniture inside." Another pause. "They said they bought the property." "That's correct." Silence. "What do you mean?" "That's correct. I sold the house." For several seconds, she didn't speak. Then came the question I had expected from the beginning. "You sold it?" "Yes, without telling us. It was my property." Her breathing grew heavier. "But we've been staying there all year." "I know, we had plans." "So did I." Her voice cracked. "Mom, why would you do this?" I answered calmly. "When you asked me not to visit my own house." She didn't interrupt. "When your attorney mailed papers asking me to give away ownership, still nothing. And when I discovered someone had changed the locks without my permission." The silence on the other end became overwhelming. "You had already decided the house belonged to you." Another long pause followed. Finally, she whispered, "We never thought you'd actually sell it." "I know." Those 4 words carried everything else that no longer needed saying. A man's voice sounded faintly in the background. "Daniel." He asked Claire something I couldn't quite hear. She covered the phone for a moment before returning. "What are we supposed to do now?" I looked through my living room window toward the flowers blooming outside. The answer came without anger. "Exactly what every homeowner does when a house doesn't belong to them." She didn't respond. Instead, the call ended quietly. I placed my phone on the coffee table and leaned back in my chair. For the first time in over a year, I wasn't waiting for someone else's next decision. My own had already been made. The phone calls continued for nearly a week. Some came from Claire. A few came from Daniel. Others arrived from numbers I didn't recognize. Most went unanswered. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I simply had nothing left to explain. Every important conversation had already happened. They just hadn't listened when it mattered. On the 8th day, Claire left a voicemail. Her voice sounded different. The confidence that had once filled every sentence had disappeared. "Mom, can we please talk? I think we both said things we shouldn't have. I know you're upset, but maybe we can work this out." I listened to the message twice before deleting it. Some problems can be solved with another conversation. Others begin because too many conversations were ignored. This was the second kind. A few days later, there was a knock on my front door. When I opened it, Claire stood on the porch alone. She looked exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes, and she held her purse tightly against her side, as though it offered protection. "May I come in?" I stepped aside without saying a word. We sat at the same kitchen table where she had shared countless cups of coffee years earlier. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. "I never thought it would end like this." I looked at her calmly. "Neither did I." She lowered her eyes. "Daniel believed that eventually you'd leave the house to us anyway. I probably would have." Her head lifted immediately. "What?" "I likely would have left it to both of my children one day." She stared at me. "Then why sell it? Because inheritance is a gift." I paused. "It isn't something people take while the owner is still alive." Tears gathered in her eyes. "I didn't realize how much we'd hurt you." I nodded slowly. "That's because neither of you stopped long enough to ask." She admitted things I had already suspected. The letter from the attorney had been Daniel's idea. Changing the locks had also been his decision. At first, she claimed she had simply gone along with his suggestions to avoid arguments. Then she stopped herself. "That's not completely true." I remained silent. I agreed because part of me started believing the house was already ours. There it was. The truth, not hidden behind excuses, not softened by careful words, just honest. "I forgot that you were sharing your dream with us," she whispered. I started treating it like my own. For the first time since everything had happened, I believed she genuinely understood. Understanding, however, didn't erase consequences. Before leaving, she asked one final question. "Is there anything I can do to fix this?" I looked toward the family photographs hanging beside the dining room. Some showed birthdays. Others showed holidays. One picture captured Richard smiling beside the lake during one of our earliest trips. I answered carefully, "You can't bring back the house." She nodded. "I know, but you can decide how you treat people from this day forward." She wiped away a tear. "I want to. I hope you do." She stood, hugged me quietly, and walked toward the front door. I hugged her back. Not because everything was repaired, but because carrying bitterness any longer would only hurt both of us. Forgiveness doesn't always rebuild trust. Sometimes, it simply allows your heart to move forward. Over the following months, life became peaceful again. I purchased a smaller cottage closer to my hometown. It required far less maintenance and overlooked a quiet park instead of a lake. Children played there every afternoon. Neighbors greeted one another during evening walks. It wasn't the dream Richard and I had once imagined. That dream had already served its purpose. Now I wanted something simpler, something lighter. Adam visited often. He never once asked about the money from the lake house. Instead, he'd help me plant flowers, repair loose fence boards, or share dinner before driving home. One evening, he looked around the cottage and smiled. "You seem happier." "I am. What changed?" I thought for a moment before answering. "I finally stopped confusing generosity with obligation." He nodded quietly. "I think Dad would have agreed. So do I." People sometimes believe the hardest part of losing a home is handing over the keys. It isn't. The hardest part is realizing someone you love stopped seeing it as yours long before you let it go. But life has a remarkable way of teaching us difficult lessons before offering peace. I don't regret building the lake house. It gave Richard's dream a place to live. I don't even regret selling it. That decision reminded me that respecting yourself is never selfish. Love should never require surrendering your dignity. Kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. And ownership, whether it's a home, a dream, or your own life, belongs to the person who had the courage to build it. Sometimes the greatest gift you can leave your family isn't a piece of property. It's the example of knowing when to stand up for yourself. That lesson, unlike any house, can never be taken away.